enjoyed that city. Second, I'm a big fan of the show that Stan's going to be talking about, The Wire. I'm midway through season 3, and he promised no spoilers past season 1, so that's good. But most importantly, because Stan Corkin always has something interesting and thoughtful to say, and I'm sure he will today. He's author and editor of numerous articles and books, including 3 on cinema and American history. One is Realism in the Birth of the Modern U.S., came out in 1996. Cowboys as Cold Warriors in 2004. And then another thing I'm really looking forward to is his book Starring New York as Itself, which I believe is due next year with Oxford University Press. I think that started in a Center Fellowship here in the Taft Center. It was furthered by a Center Fellowship. We're always happy to see the product of that. And now he's turning his attention from the Big Apple to Charm City. And he's going to be presenting today on, get the title right again, Representing the Post-Industrial, HBO's The Wire, and the Discrete Spaces of Baltimore.
So this is just background music, so I'll talk over this as I'll probably talk over many clips, but you know, there's 2 little Bobby Bear and academia. So in the song of the Streets of Baltimore, written by Compton Glazer and the Glazer Brothers in 1966, and recorded by an array of country and country rock performers, from the immortal Bobby Bear to Charlie Pride to Coldplay. The final refrain talks about losing his love to a life of prostitution on the wild streets of Baltimore. Just leave it there. The song has become something of a country standard, but its sentiments now seem ironic, since no one would ever confuse the Baltimore of the 2000s with the far more dynamic urban locales, such as New York, or even its proximate neighbor, Washington. In looking back at the 1960s and seeing this tale as one of complaint against the necessity of urbanization, a song much like Mel Tillis' far more popular Detroit City, which you will see in the right column, we can see that Baltimore describes as lured to rural whites and African Americans, as well as a place where legitimate employment was not up to the demands of an ever-increasing population. Now it's a dramatically decreasing population. In the 1950s and 60s, cities such as Baltimore, on the border of North and South, with significant industry and a role in international shipping, were a destination for those who had been displaced by the shrinking demand for labor in the agricultural sector. Ironically, while migrants continued to come to cities like Detroit and Baltimore, the jobs that lured them were already moving elsewhere. Indeed, by 1966, Baltimore was experiencing the beginnings of the ravages of deindustrialization. Even in the decade of the 1950s, a period of generalized national economic growth, the city's manufacturing base fell by 12%. But this was only a harbinger of things to come. Between the early 1950s and 1990, employment in the manufacturing center in the city of Baltimore fell from 127,000 to only 40,000. David Simon's production, The Wire, is about Baltimore, and Baltimore is both historically specific and similar to many other cities of comparable size, employment structure, and demographics. It's like Pittsburgh, Cincinnati, and Buffalo, in that its post-World War II economy was mixed among the industrial and service sectors, and that it benefited historically from its geography, including its proximity to a major shipping lane. Like those other cities, it was also the site of significant migration from the south, including a significant African-American migration from that region. But it is not like New York, Miami, Los Angeles, Chicago, Houston, in that it lacks a significant financial services sector and does not draw much population from regions outside the U.S. Unlike those cities, it has no claim to World City status and therefore lacks the economic dynamism that accompanies that designation. It is the representation of the city as it exists just after the turn of the 21st century that lies at the center of David Simon's 5-season, 60-episode drama, The Wire. Simon calls the show an attempt to depict a world where both the police and the drug dealers are screwed up. The police department is dysfunctional, and the drug culture has an equally disastrous bureaucracy. We are trying to focus on the individuals within the institutions and what institutions do to individuals. For the most part, Baltimore is a place largely without jobs that allow for the comforts of middle-class existence for those without specific skills and access to higher education. The Wire focuses on the way in which urban despair is created and enabled by the institutional structures that articulate the terms and limits of ghetto life. Drugs are not so much the catalyst for the misery as they are a symptom of the extremes of inequality and social isolation. The most obvious feature of the first season, and arguably all 5 seasons, is the centrality of the representation of race and its infinite attendant issues. The show references, however fleetingly, a historical context that allows for an understanding of the contemporary terms of African American life. If we follow Simon's allusions, we can see the deep scars of historical racism. In the aftermath of slavery came the racial violence and economic constraints known as the Jim Crow system of segregation, a system that lasted from the 1890s to the 1960s and arguably later, as well as the system of economic peonage known as sharecropping that largely existed until the wide introduction of mechanized cotton picking after World War II, which is of course the catalyst for the second wave of African American urban migration. The impact of these systems lingers on in the world as represented. Indeed, when we see men without work, we can see the historical impact of racist practices. These practices have important ramifications for the contemporary economic conditions of some number of African Americans. In season 2, for example, when we see the competition between union leader Frank Sobotka and his apparent heir, the African American Nate Coxon, for the presidency of Longshoremen's Union, we can see referenced, if we look, the historical segregation of unionized work and the preferences in pay and jobs afforded to those in white locals. In such a context, the assertion by Coxon that it's his time has a kind of historical resonance that requires a knowledge of such racialized employment practices. Our way into this vision is gradual. This broader emphasis does not become clear until we are well into season 1, when we have encountered the drug-dealing gang at the low-rise housing projects many times and seen the ways in which the drug lords, Avon Barksdale and Stringer Bell, enforce their power over the ghetto. Season 1, the specific focus of the rest of the presentation, devises this overarching narrative around the pursuit by the police of the drug distribution network controlled by Bell and Barksdale, centered in the housing projects, low-rises and high-rises on the west side of Baltimore. In our first scene, after the credits, we find a recurring character, Jimmy McNulty, in court. We see the lieutenant in the Barksdale drug organization, D'Angelo Barksdale, a nephew to its leader, named Avon, on trial for murder. McNulty is intensely interested in the proceedings. At this point, we begin our dramatic investigation of the interdependent relationships among cops, courts, and criminals. But these relationships are predicated on the existence of a captive market for these substances. One recurring idea that is entertained in the season, and others, is if drugs were not illegal, then would there be no murder, no trial, and no police investigation? Indeed, a variation on this premise is explored in season 3, when a drug-free zone is set up within a command district run by a character named Bunny Colvin. But more than about the drug trade and the Barksdale-McNulty contest and its aridity and futility, the show is about the social conditions that create such action. Simon has affirmed that his goal was to create a show that was the antithesis of the formulaic police dramas of network television. But it is also clear that his means to achieving that end is to incorporate key elements of that formula. Thus, The Wire includes the same structural elements that divide Law and Order, Hill Street Blues, NYPD Blue, and so on. This is the tripartite representation of cops, criminal, and legal system that is, unlike in these other productions, only the tip of the iceberg. The goal of the series, then, is evidenced by the production and affirmed by Simon, is to chronicle the social conditions of the city of Baltimore and other cities like it, as they exist in the early years of the 2000s. In the commentary on season 1, Simon declares that The Wire is about the world of the city and of those excluded from the America defined by material comfort, middle-class lifestyles, and predictable circumstances.